Hey everybody, good morning. So, we all know that 2020 was a hot mess. That was obviously a pandemic year and a lot of other tough things happened as well. But for me, 2018 was just as bad because my life, as I knew it, had fallen apart. The year had started out so promising. I had a shiny new job that was moving me more into the community work and away from recruiting. I had been accepted to give my second international keynote. I was happily married with a dog and a cat. I was training for half marathons. I was hosting soccer, football to you all parties and board game nights on a regular basis. I was traveling regularly. And I will, hang on a second. Oh, this is So anyway, like I was saying, I was basically at that point where, when you kind of graduate school and you start envisioning what your adult life will look like? Well, I was at the point where that's where my life was. The job, the travel, the spouse, the dogs, everything I wanted. And then my ex told me he had rented an apartment without my knowledge. This happened just a couple weeks after I had fractured my ribs. And over the next few months, I would be rear-ended by a car. I had to put my first corgi to sleep. And I was laid off from that job that I thought was so exciting while I was across the country in California from Ohio, where I lived. Now, before losing that job, I had been struggling with it because there had been a mismatch. The company had hired me, telling me I would be doing employee and community engagement, but pigeonholed me to staying into tech recruiting, which was what I did at the time. So it was a failure on their part, but also on mine. And so I learned from that, and I learned from all of the other bad stuff that happened in 2018. I'm here to share these lessons today with a little side of agile knowledge as well. So it's been long enough that I'm kind of tired of telling this story, but it's kind of my origin story lately, and so I can't share my experiences or my lessons learned about failure without talking about all of that bad stuff that happened. And at the time, I felt like I was failing at everything in life. I knew I needed support to survive that year. And I knew that in order for me to get that support, I had to make myself vulnerable. I had to be willing to open up to my friends about what I was going through, and this was hard. I pride myself on being a strong person, and I can handle and overcome challenges and succeed at almost anything I put my mind to. But even the strongest people need help sometimes. So everybody fails. And we hear a lot of emphasis on how awesome we feel after overcoming failure. The example I always use is, you always hear these stories at the Olympics where maybe the star athlete breaks their leg and thinks they won't be able to compete. But then magically, months or a year later, they go on and they win a gold medal. But what nobody talks about is the time between the broken leg and the gold medal. Nobody talks about that time between the failure and the subsequent success. And honestly, the awesome outcome, that happy ending, is so hard to see when you're in the middle of failure. It's hard to see when you can't get yourself out of bed or see a way out of your mess, and it can be easy to give in to despair. So, how do you get through the time between that initial failure and subsequent positive result of failing? You allow yourself to be vulnerable. So what is vulnerability? This is defined as the quality or the state of being exposed to the possibility of being harmed or attacked. Notice that this definition says the possibility of being attacked. It doesn't say that you will be harmed, and in my experience, I've actually benefited from being vulnerable, being open, getting up on stage and talking about mental health and the struggles we go through as humans in technology, far more than I've been harmed by it. Now, vulnerability is not the same thing as a weakness. A weakness is a lack of strength, a disadvantage, a fault, and whether we like it or not, weaknesses are things that generally exist. I need to wear contacts because I can't see well without them. That's a weakness. On the other hand, vulnerability is a state. And it's a state that we can, and I would argue that we should, choose to enter, knowing that it might reveal some weaknesses, but believing it's worth it by exposing some of them and doing scary things. So before we go farther, we're going to talk about vulnerability, Agile, and how you can use them to get through a failure. So I first learned about Scrum and Agile within weeks, if not days, of my first tech recruiting job. For the record, I'm no longer a tech recruiter. I am now the community manager at Cassandra by Veeam. We're a Kubernetes data backup platform, and I manage communities of learners, open source contributors, and users of our products. But at the time, I was a recruiter. And as a recruiter, I wanted to understand the technology and the things I was recruiting for, and Agile was the new hotness. I've actually never worked on a team where we didn't use some aspects of Agile and Scrum. But when I first learned about it, it blew my mind, because I'd never seen a formal way of breaking down projects into small pieces or handling failure. And it encouraged failure, which I'd been in sales prior. That certainly wasn't encouraged in sales. It wasn't encouraged in school or anywhere else in my life. My mind was blown. So I learned a lot about Agile and about Scrum, of course about the problems when it comes to being dogmatic about those things. And I learned how adaptable it is to business processes and non-technical roles. And being the nerd I am, I actually started borrowing Agile in my personal life. My ADHD brain actually really likes this process because it helps me take these big, giant, overwhelming things like writing a talk and breaking it down into small components that I can focus on one at a time. What I didn't realize until the past few years is that it's also given me a framework for discussing and handling failures in my personal life that I had never had before. First, though, just in case some of you all aren't on teams that haven't used Agile or aren't familiar, we're going to do a quick little Agile and Scrum 101. Most of this material is taken from scrum.org and their Scrum guide. Your Agile and Scrum may look different, they probably do, and that's fine. This isn't a deep dive on Agile ceremonies, it's just to kind of familiarize or refresh people with the core concepts that give us a framework for failing. So Agile is a set of values and principles that remind us that people and not computers create and maintain software. It requires courage because we have to admit that building software is complex. It's never going to be perfectly planned. It's never going to be perfect the right time. But what's really important about it is that Agile is focused first and foremost on people. Now, when I was a tech recruiter, I had a lot of hiring managers and people who would refer to programmers almost as these coder robots. You know, they expected people to work 18 hours a day on caffeine and be these super logical machines and not necessarily be human beings, whole human beings. So that's why my focus is on the human side of technology. So Stephen Denning wrote the 7 Principles of Continuous Innovation in The Leader's Guide to Radical Management. And this tells us kind of what Agile is all about. First of all, it's about delighting clients. Your clients could be your end users, or they could be, if you're in consulting, the company that's hired you to do the work. Agile requires self-organizing teams. Whatever, generally whoever's best at certain roles kind of naturally takes on those roles. The iterations, the changes, the progress are driven by your clients. And it's focused on delivering value to the clients in each iteration. A lot of times those are, 2 weeks. Now, the important things for today's conversation are that Agile requires radical transparency. If something hasn't worked out, you have to tell the client that it hasn't worked out yet. But that leads you to continuous improvement. You're constantly looking back at the work you did and seeing what went wrong and what went right. And it requires interactive communication. Like I was saying, radical transparency, continuous improvement, those relate directly to failure. To an extent, so does interactive communication, and transparency will help you with all of these things. Scrum is the lightweight framework, often used along Agile, that helps people's teams and organizations address problems and adapt to change. It helps create things iteratively and incrementally in a way to respond to change efficiently. And again, when we're failing, life is changing all the time, and so we can borrow from this and start learning how to fail better. The typical Scrum team, it allows teams to organize themselves as they adapt to challenges. These teams are non-hierarchical, and they focus on the product goal one objective at a time. The teams are made up of your Scrum Master, who is responsible for helping the team basically understand Scrum theory and practice, your Product Owner, whose job is to try to maximize the value of Scrum, and the developers, who do the hands-on work. Now, I did actually take the Professional Scrum Master class. I worked for a consulting company that used Agile in how we ran the business, as well as did Agile coaching and training. So I took the class just to be able to speak the language. Kind of wish I'd gotten the certification, but I never did. And as far as product ownership goes, I was actually a product owner for a couple months before I was put into a developer relations evangelism role. And then I was laid off from that role a couple months later. Now, that kicked off a failure, but that failure ultimately led to success because through that evangelism role, I had wanted to move in developer relations and community managing. And that evangelism role gave me just enough experience and an actual dev role title to put on my resume. And that all led to my current job at Caston, which I'm only 4 months in. I'm learning everything that I'm doing as we go, and we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. Scrum values are things that the whole team agrees on. To me, these values apply everywhere, in my relationships, in my friendships, in my interactions. You have to have courage to do the right thing, even if there's pushback, even if there's people who want to argue with you. You need to focus on that end goal, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, and sometimes what you're trying to achieve is just getting through a really hard day. You commit to achieving the goals, so you set that goal, and you're going to work to get there. It requires respect. You need to respect other people as capable and independent. You also need to respect yourself and understand that you are capable and independent even when it seems or feels like you're not. And it requires openness about your work and about the challenges that you're going through. Scrum also has several events. They're generally time-boxed, and they don't all relate to failure, but retros and sprints can also actually help you learn how to be more effective. So your sprint is basically your fixed period of time when all the work toward the goal happens. Sprint planning is when you plan out that goal. Your daily scrum is kind of a daily update that your team gives where people talk about the specific things that they are working on. You have sprint reviews where you kind of sit back and look at what happened. And you have my personal favorite, the retrospective. I love doing retros. I do them for work projects. I do them for conference talks and sponsorships with myself. I have done them for things like hosting a party, training for a race, any number of things. I always think it's a good idea to sit back and think about what went wrong, what went right, what do I want to start doing, stop doing, or continue doing. So what does failure have to do with that? Well, I'm not always a fan of silly acronyms, but I did like one that set FAIL as first attempt in learning. And Agile relies on honestly admitting that you're not going to plan your products perfectly. It assumes there's going to be a failure from the very beginning, and it's built into the methodology. And it involves experimentation. Scrum relies on failure and mistakes actually to be successful. It relies on empiricism, kind of like the scientific method that we all learned about in school. So think of your sprint goal or your personal goal as a hypothesis. Hypotheses aren't always right. And in both the sprint review and the retro, the team reflects on what went wrong. And the important thing is that after you reflect on what went wrong, think about what it is that you can do to fix it. So in the midst of failure, things don't feel safe. When I found myself without a job, a spouse, with fractured ribs, I didn't feel safe. More recently, back in 2020, back in the fall, I was laid off due to some budget cuts from my contracting position. It was my 4th layoff in 4 years. And none of these were due to my performance, as evidenced by my managers who gave me glowing recommendations for my next jobs. Layoffs are scary to go through, and for me, they trigger some major anxiety and make me wonder what's wrong with me. If I'm so good at my job, if my performance reviews are always so amazing, why am I getting laid off? A lot of times, honestly, it comes down to budget. But having the support of my community, both personally and professionally, helps me. More recently, my partner and I are talking to our 13-year-old daughter, and she likes to put a lot of pressure on herself to try to be perfect. And we were telling her, you're not going to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes. You are going to fail, and we want you to do that. Yes, there might be consequences. Yes, we might be upset at you. But if you don't fail, you don't learn. So failing safely, that's what we're trying to do, is give an environment of freedom and flexibility, trust, and support freedom to experiment, the flexibility to switch directions and pivot like we do in Agile, and trust that others will do the right thing until they prove otherwise, and support us as we work through these processes. So, failing quickly. In Agile, as in my life, we focus on failing quickly. This allows you to kind of course correct early on, and you can repair and adapt as opposed to getting all the way to an end of a project or a scenario and realizing that it's completely off base from what you were going for. It means that failure only affects maybe one aspect of a product rather than the whole thing. Now, lessons that I've learned from the Agile view of failure that help me get through life. Scrum is about figuring out what's worth building to improve your customers' lives while mitigating risks. It teaches you that failure is not the end of the world, as hard as it can be to hear. And it tells you that openly discussing failure without fear of consequences, punishment, it helps everybody learn. Now, what happens if we don't allow room for failure, at work or at home? Well, you can tell people you don't want to fail, you're not allowed to fail, but failure is going to happen. We're humans, we're fallible, we're going to screw up. But when we don't allow people to fail, it creates a culture of fear. It creates a culture where people are afraid to speak up, state their opinions, make new suggestions. If people aren't allowed to fail, they can feel excluded, especially people who are newer or just learning. And this is where I am right now. So I just started my job at Cassandra about 4 months ago. I manage 3 communities, one of a Kubernetes learning platform called Cube Campus, one that is open source projects, and one that is our Cassandra users. Now, I know just enough JavaScript to be dangerous. I'm not a programmer by any means. And so as part of my job, I'm actually sharing my rookie Kubernetes learning journey. And from the very beginning, when I'm teaching labs to people at conferences, when I'm talking to people, and even in my job interviews, I've owned it. I've owned the fact that I'm just learning this. I have a whole 3 months of experience, and I'm excited that I'm allowed to have that safety in my current role, and I know that a year from now, it's going to be amazing to bring other people on and into my community and allow them to fail. It hinders learning. If people aren't allowed to fail, they don't bother to learn because they're too afraid. And when people aren't learning and when they're afraid to speak up, they also don't feel innovative. They might feel afraid to suggest things. And honestly, it's just crappy to work for someone who expects perfection. How many people here have seen the Lego movie? Okay, so you know the boss in the Lego movie who's like, all I expect is total perfection? That's kind of the vibe you get from a team where you're not allowed to fail. And nobody wants to work for that person. It lowers morale, it lowers retention, people leave, people don't get work done. In retrospect, I have a long history of failure. One of my first failures was actually going to law school. I have a degree in philosophy and political science, not the most marketable of degrees. And I kind of on autopilot decided after my undergraduate to go to law school. And then I realized about 9 months in that it wasn't for me. So I stuck it out for a year, and then I quit, and I dropped out. And I was nervous about this because my dad is a lawyer, and I was worried he'd be disappointed in me. But it didn't matter because I needed to do what was right for me. So I took a break off of school, stepped back to think about what I wanted to do with myself, and went for my MBA. My MBA in organizational leadership and marketing actually set me on the career path that I have now, which I didn't expect that at the time either. So since that happened, I always give people the advice to take a year between undergrad and further education, or even pursuing any education. Think about whether it's what you really want to do and why you want to do that. I also let people know it's okay if they don't know what they want to do with your lives yet. I don't know about you all, but 18-year-old me was a lot different than 42-year-old me, and most 18-year-olds don't know what they want to do with their life. They don't even know what they don't know yet. And so it's okay. And I give people the same advice when they're considering career changes or pivots. Try it out. The worst that happens is it doesn't work. Just think about why you're doing something and whether it aligns with your goals and your priorities. And if it happens, yeah, you'll fail. But then you'll learn, and then you'll succeed. So, in spite of how we embrace failure in some ways, and in spite of the fact that I'm up here talking about, oh, I fail all the time and it's great, no, it really sucks. And it could start to suck less, but it's never fun to admit when you messed up. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with this when you're laid off from a job, when your project is going sideways, when you're going through a major personal struggle? How do you get through it? Well, we fail at things every single day. Maybe they're little things, like you brewed a cup of coffee and left it sitting on the counter for 3 hours and forgot about it. You fed your dogs 15 minutes late. Failures can also be borderline catastrophic, things like job loss, divorce, accident. A lot of times, though, failure is in between these extremes, and it can be relative. So maybe you missed a meeting, you forgot to complete an assignment, you paid your electric bill 2 days late. These things aren't usually the end of the world, but they're frustrating. And failures sometimes even seem catastrophic, even when they aren't. Don't minimize something that you view as a minor failure, because even if it's a minor failure to you, some days it's a problem. Don't say it's not that bad. Some days I spill my coffee all over my dress and it feels like the end of the world and it's the worst thing that could have ever happened because it's just a bad day anyway. Other days I do it and it's funny and I make a joke about it. So just remember that sometimes things might seem catastrophic some days and not others. Now, the only way that we can survive failure is to be vulnerable, is to be open. Now, I know that InfoSec people don't like to talk about vulnerability. They work to keep it away, but we're going to talk about it. And vulnerability is what got me through 2018 through 2020 when my life was falling apart. Vulnerability also got me through that very lonely and isolating time in the pandemic. Now, before 2018, I didn't want anybody to see anything bad about my life. I wanted everybody to think everything was perfect. But when your life is completely falling apart, you can't hide it. It's impossible. And so, you cause people to worry and you can push them away. And I was always viewed as this strong, happy woman in colorful clothes, and I think I needed to keep that persona up, that I always needed to be strong, happy, and positive, especially in an industry that's so male-dominated, because if I showed weakness or vulnerability, I was going to be attacked. Now, when I first started talking about vulnerability, I did it as part of a talk that I give discussing mental illness and prioritizing mental health in technology. I was very vulnerable in that talk. There are videos all over YouTube of me saying, I have depression, anxiety, and ADHD, my brain doesn't work, and we're going to talk about this on a stage. I was vulnerable myself when I gave that talk, and I encouraged other people to do the same thing. And eventually I realized that there is a power in vulnerability. Now, every time I gave that talk, someone would ask if I read Brene Brown. Has anybody read Brene Brown's Power of Vulnerability? So, every time somebody would ask me that question, I would say I hadn't. But when I was preparing for this talk, I finally read Daring Greatly as part of my prep work, and I actually did appreciate what she had to say. I kind of held off because I wanted to form my own opinions before kind of getting influenced by some expert. But the section where she talked about vulnerability myths put my own fears into words, and this quote in particular struck me. It says, vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It's the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. And if we want greater clarity and purpose, or deeper and more meaningful lives, vulnerability is the path. Now, she talks about these vulnerability myths, ways that we view vulnerability. We view it as a weakness. We view it as a bad thing. But like I said earlier, weakness is a thing that exists. Vulnerability is a state that we enter. There's this whole, it's not something I do. I'm not vulnerable. I don't share things about myself. There's a concept of it oversharing. I mean, some people might say it's oversharing for me to tell you that my ex-husband rented an apartment behind my back, but it's part of my story. It's vulnerable, and it's been led to some lessons learned. And there's this idea of I'm fine on my own, I don't need anybody else. She also talks about this vulnerability armor we put up and says that instead of this armor, we should actually do what she calls daring greatly. So she talks about foreboding joy. This is that kind of something is a bad situation, but you just try to only see the positive of it and pretend like everything is okay, when in reality it's better to practice gratitude. So when I have a bad day, when I have a rough day, sometimes I'll sit back and it's easy to focus just on what went wrong. When I was interviewing for jobs most recently, I was getting very caught up in what went wrong on the day, and I eventually decided that I should focus on what went right and be grateful for that. So be grateful for the fact that I had another interview. Be grateful for the fact that I learned that a certain company wasn't the right fit for me. Perfectionism is vulnerability armor, and it's also one I've used. If I show this perfect little life and everybody sees that, then I'll be safe. But I love people, I love humanity, and I appreciate the beauty in the cracks and the beauty in the messiness. I think that's what makes people interesting to work with. There's numbing. Maybe you numb with substances. Maybe you numb with video games. Maybe you numb by sleeping. There's all these different ways that people numb themselves, when instead we should set boundaries and find ways to really comfort ourselves. And then letting it all hang out is actually another form of vulnerability armor. These are the people who share way, way too much information, people who share all the details of the messy breakup. But instead, you clarify your intentions. And that's why I'm very careful when I talk about this stuff to say, oh, I'm not looking for pity, I'm not looking for sympathy. I am sharing this stuff because I know other people go through it and might need the help. Other shielding methodologies or methods are cynicism, criticism, cruelty, kind of wiggling out of the way of the vulnerable situations and playing the victim. So why is it so hard for us to be vulnerable and transparent? Well, we work in tech, and technology professionals are nothing if not logically minded, and emotions are not logical. It is not logical for me to start crying tears of joy because I'm on an airplane taking off, but it happens. It happens. So, like I said, life was falling apart, and I had to be open and vulnerable, even if it meant sometimes canceling plans, letting others down, deprioritizing things that had previously been important to me. For instance, I was at the time running a software development conference that was Microsoft plus open source products, and I resigned from the board because as important as that conference and that community was to me, I didn't have the mental or emotional capacity to work on it. And honestly, every time I do this stuff, it also does me more harm than good. And encouraging people to ask questions and learn, that helps prevent the imposter syndrome that we all like to talk about. And people find out it's okay to ask for help, and they're more successful as a result. And people feel more comfortable taking risks. So, in the middle of failure, I started doing scary things that made me feel challenged, even vulnerable. I had been restricted from trying challenging things. I had been restricted from trying challenging things for such a long time for a lot of reasons and due to some toxic influences in my life. And maybe at the time, when everything was falling apart, I was just sad and looking for that dopamine hit. And honestly, all of my biggest fears had come true, so I thought, what have I got to lose? So, the international keynote I was invited to give, I still went to Romania, and I did it, even though I was going alone to a country I knew nothing about and hadn't even really been on my radar for travel. Now, I've been fortunate enough to travel quite a bit, but it's almost always been with somebody else. As a matter of fact, before 2018, the only other time I had traveled alone, it was when I was in college, flying to Mexico to study abroad and then intern. But in that case, my parents dropped me off at the airport. This was back in the day when your people could actually even go up to the airplane gate. And on the other end, I was meeting my fellow classmates and students, so I wasn't really all that alone. So when it came to Romania, one of my bucket list items had always been to fly upstairs on a plane, specifically a Boeing 747. I was just fascinated by the old school glam. And so when I found out my flight was on a 747, I spent all of my credit card points and miles and upgraded my flight. And I still remember walking up that stairs to that seat, having a big-time main character moment, and feeling like, I can do this. I got this. On that trip, I also booked tickets to the sea. I actually hadn't known that Romania had beachfront towns, but I booked tickets to the sea. I spent time by myself a lot of other ways, and then that led me to this whole summer where I basically just started saying yes to every opportunity that came along and doing things by myself in the midst of failure, and that all strengthened me. So when we're failing, like I said, we need to practice gratitude and not toxic positivity. Now, toxic positivity is that, oh, look on the bright side, it's not so bad that your leg was cut off. Like, no, that's crap. It actually was bad. So instead of practicing that toxic positivity, practice the gratitude and focus on what was good. And try to remind yourself that good things came out of the situation where you failed. Anymore, when bad stuff happens, Not gonna lie, I'm sad about it. I can be devastated. If I was to get laid off again, I don't quite know what I'd do. But I also kind of think about it as like, hey, it's a good story. It's some talk material. You know, a few months from now, it might be an interesting or funny scenario even, this failure that I had right now. When we're going through failure, we need to rely on our support system, at work and at home. Now, this would not be a Cassandra Faris talk if I did not mention the importance of a community, a support system, and people around you that take care of you. You need friends, and you need people in your lives, and you need to reach out to them when you're struggling. On the flip side, cut the toxic people out of your life, or accept that your life is better because the toxic people left. This can be hard at first. In 2020, I cut ties with a very longtime friend because she was just becoming a very toxic influence. But overall, I've realized my life is better without her. And rely on the good people in your life and reciprocate. That's how friendship works. Right now, I'm thankfully having a good time in my life. I don't have really any major crises going on, but some of my friends do. And so it's my job as a friend to support them the way that they supported me. And we see that as well in our technology community. If, you're working and your friend is laid off, go ahead and try to help them find a new job. Share their resume, refer them for positions, support each other. When you're failing, you can look for ways to gain new perspectives. For me, this is travel. A lot of people some people take up, religions, they take up a hobby, they take up athletics, they take up any number of other things, and it can help you clarify a lot. So if travel's not your thing, if it doesn't help you gain new perspectives and feel like you've taken a break, then find something else that does. Find something that puts you in exposes you to new things and gets you out of the house. Literally make a list of things that you would like to do that could give you new perspectives and pick one or two of those things. When you're going through failure, distractions are great. Now, I think about early pandemic, especially when everybody was baking sourdough bread and learning how to make TikToks and picking up new hobbies and in the midst of these whole house reorganizations. So you can keep your eyes on the prize of surviving failure and getting through that tough time. But know that in spite of that, you can have hard days. And so don't pressure yourself to learn a new hobby or a goal. I had intended to actually make a TikTok and have my corgis doing TikTok dances. And I just decided during the pandemic I did not have capacity to learn a new social media platform, so I never actually did that. But I know I am somebody who does better when I keep busy. So in various failure and tough situations, this has meant most recently signing up for a new form of fitness class where I've started to learn aerial acrobatics on aerial silks. Volunteering for causes that I care about. I also recently joined the board of a conference that is the conference where I got my start as a speaker. Stress baking is one of my favorite distractions. In the pandemic, when it became clear that swimming pools and things weren't going to be open, I actually bought an above-ground pool for my backyard, learned how to maintain and test the chemicals. Felt a little off the rails, but then it gave me a swimming pool for the summer where me and my little quarantine pod could hang out. I also got a puppy during the pandemic, though that wasn't necessarily because of the pandemic. I'd planned on getting the second dog in the fall of 2020, and when I realized I was going to be stuck at home for the foreseeable future, I actually wound up getting in touch with my dog's breeder and got him in the spring instead. But also, keeping myself occupied and distracted can mean playing The Sims or Animal Crossing for hours and hours and hours, or spending way too long laying on my couch watching TikToks and Instagram reels. Retail therapy is a distraction as well, and sometimes an influencer gets me and I'll shop. Indulging in various vices, those are all also distractions that happen. So not all distractions need to be healthy and good all of the time. Sometimes they can just be a break, and that's okay. Our brains need breaks and our bodies need breaks. I will say, though, you should avoid making major, non-urgent life decisions. So you're not thinking clearly necessarily when you're in the midst of a failure, and you might make wrong decisions, or you might make the right decision for the wrong reason. In retrospect, changing jobs while everything in my life would fall apart, especially when I was at a job I'd really loved, I just didn't really have any growth paths at it, probably not my wisest idea. I'm not sure I'd have been kind of bait and switched by that next role as easily if I hadn't been in such a bad place in other areas of my life. You only have so much capacity, and in the midst of a failure, a lot of that just needs to be spent on the urgent decisions and caring for yourself, and not necessarily making other major disruptive changes in your life. Now, in spite of all of this, you can have all of the coping mechanisms and therapists and everything else in the world, but setbacks are going to happen and they still suck. So it's easier said than done to take up all these new hobbies and keep yourself distracted and focus on the positive, and sometimes none of that stuff works. This is where this gets a little bit meta. When I was preparing for this talk, this full, Pippin, I was coming home from a soccer/football game, and I had bent down to greet the dog, and he jumped up, and the top of his head hit me on the chin and gave me a concussion, which is kind of the most on-brand injury for me ever, coming home from a soccer game and getting a concussion. But as a result, it actually affected me for a good year and a half cognitively. I got very behind on writing this talk because I was having trouble processing, and I still have some trouble sometimes with processes and words, even though that concussion was 2 years ago now. So failure happens repeatedly. Things go wrong all the time. And as I mentioned before, when I was a product owner, those first 2 layoffs I went through after that were rough. And our industry does have some high turnover rates. But each of those job changes and each of those layoffs allowed me to think back on what I really liked about the position and what I wanted to do more of and what I disliked and wanted to do less of. And then I used those to find my current job, which is an absolute dream. I'm managing people, I'm teaching, I'm networking, I'm sharing, I'm a liaison between users, developers, and the product itself, and I love it. But all of these failures have led me to that situation. And all that said, hard days are still going to be hard, so sometimes a setback is more serious and you just need a break, and that's okay to admit that. Please admit you need a break, and please take the break. It's okay to give in to hard days, even if it means taking a day off work, and you can communicate that to your team at work. I've been fortunate enough that on most of my teams, I've been able to straight up say, hey, I'm having a bad mental health day, I need to take a day off work. If that's something that's not acceptable on your team or you're not comfortable doing, it's enough just call up your manager and say, hey, I'm not feeling well, and don't tell them what's up. They have no right to know. Now, you're never going to get help if you don't ask. And I am very quick to ask for help, and I'm very quick to offer help. So others have helped me, and so I help them back, and we all come out better for it. So the thing is, you have to ask because people can't read your mind, and they don't necessarily know what you're going through. And understand that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to have bad days. It's okay to have days where the most amazing thing you accomplished is that you got out of bed and brushed your teeth and fed your dog. That's okay sometimes. You can get professional help when you're going through failure. You can get professional help if you're going through a failure on a project. Turn to somebody more senior than you and ask them for help. If you're struggling with mental health issues, go ahead, seek out professional help. I got therapy, I take medications. I also talk about this stuff a lot to make it okay for other people to do those things. So if you need help and you think that your friends aren't going to be enough or your current mechanisms aren't going to be enough, then go ahead and seek out a professional. And you can help others fail successfully. So a quote from Daring Greatly that I really liked was that the simple and honest process of letting people know that discomfort is normal, it's going to happen, why it happens, and why it's important reduces anxiety, fear, and shame. And I'm finding this. This is why I keep saying the more I'm vulnerable, the more I open myself, the stronger, more comfortable, and more supported and actually successful I feel. So it's good to remember, and it's good to call that out. Let your team know that they might be uncomfortable when they start a new project. Let yourself know you might be uncomfortable when you're going through a tough time. Acknowledge the awkwardness, acknowledge that it's weird sometimes to be vulnerable and emotional, and move on. And make it okay for other people to say that they don't know. You need to respect your boundaries, and this has been probably the biggest lesson I've learned through all of my failures, is to step back and reflect and retrospect on what are my values, what are my wants, what are my desires, how do I have more of that in my life? Your boundaries help you from sharing too much, taking on too much, or doing things just because you feel obligated. And having them actually helps you maintain your reputation and your relationships. It is uncomfortable to state boundaries. A year and a half ago or so, told a family member that I was not going to attend an event that they wanted me to attend. And I felt so weird in this text message I was writing and saying like, hey, I know you want me to go to this thing, but I'm not comfortable going for it. This is a boundary that I have set for myself, and I would like for you to respect that. I felt like the biggest jerk ever. But the response I got was, oh, okay, I understand, and the event was never brought up again. The thing about boundaries is that they are flexible. They can change and they should change. And it's important to check in regularly with your boundaries before, during, and after a failure. Sometimes a failure reveals new boundaries or stretches out your boundaries. It does that for me all the time. So, a lot of times when we're in the midst of failure, we only see one path to success. There was a point in my life where I thought I would be only successful if I put my life back together like a puzzle the same way that it had been before. I didn't realize that maybe it had become the wrong life for me and that I had changed enough that that wasn't what I needed anymore. So I can't say I'm thankful for everything I went through, because that would be total bullshit, but I am glad that I learned so much about myself and navigating life. And so when my life was falling apart, I committed to a year of saying yes to nearly everything and every opportunity that came my way. This wound up being small things, like doing karaoke at conferences when I'm a horrible singer and a lot of other speakers are great singers, or going to a festival alone. And it led to bigger things, committing to my partner, also accepting a chance to speak at a conference in Antarctica as a person who hates snow and didn't have anybody going with me to this conference. And at times it felt like I was going a little mad and a little off the rails, but it was also a lot of fun, and it's helped me so much to keep taking on these challenging things, and so I still try to do things that are purposely uncomfortable and scary to me this day. So at some point you get to a point where you're ready to take on the new challenges, and you're ready to face them. So how do you do them? Well, repetition. All those uncomfortable things I do help me be more willing to do other uncomfortable things. And again, knowing your boundaries, telling people no, and practice setting and stating your boundaries. Now, being vulnerable is scary. I put on Instagram yesterday that I was nervous to be doing this talk in such a large room when it's so open, especially in our industry that's so logical and values productivity. But sometimes the things we feel most vulnerable about are illogical, but they're still valid and they're still something that we should open up about. I risked the loss of people and opportunities in my life. When I started speaking on mental health and tech, I knew that that could be a potential risk for future jobs. But I also came to realize that if somebody didn't want to hire me or work with me because of that, they weren't going to be the right fit for me anyway. And so that's what you learn by understanding your boundaries. Now, loss sucks, failure sucks, but being stuck with somebody or something that makes you feel worse, doesn't fulfill your needs, or feels like they bring you down and influence you negatively, that sucks even more. So when things seem overwhelming, or like they're falling apart, a lot of times I think about whether it can be put back together. If it can't be put back together, if I've been laid off, there's no getting that job back, so I have to work through the mourning, the loss, the consequences. But a lot of times things can be put back together, which can seem like an insurmountable task. But like I said, it's a lot. It's a lot to go through. There's a lot of steps involved from the loss of a job to a new job. Breaking down things into pieces, breaking down things into small parts, and reflecting as I go through the process has helped me put my career and other aspects of my life together. So when I first learned about Agile and Scrum and embracing failure, especially in a professional context, like I said, my mind was blown. But eventually I came to understand that failure was inevitable. Sometimes when I hired a candidate, they weren't going to be the right candidate. Sometimes when I was trying to teach a topic, I might mess up one of the lessons. But I learned that that's okay, in a way that I'd never known before. And I think that seeing it was okay to fail at work has actually allowed me to embrace failure in my personal life as well. So failure can force you to step back and reflect on what really matters. And I remember thinking I wanted my own life back. I didn't realize at the time that happiness and success looked different to me then than they did when I thought I had somebody else basically telling me or dictating to me how my success should look. And so I'm grateful for this cycle of failure, learning, and succeeding. Now, did anybody else here pick up Animal Crossing during the pandemic? So, played a lot of Animal Crossing during the pandemic. It was soothing, it was relaxing. And in the game, you can take these like mystery boat rides, and this little turtle guy, Captain, he sings a little song. And one day, his song hit me right in the feels. And it's kind of how I think about failure, and it's kind of how I think about life now. But it said, don't cry about the dreams that don't come true today. Sometimes you need to try another way. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions. You can find me at Cassandra Faris pretty much on every social media platform. And does anybody have any questions? Yep.